Hey everybody, Dr. Duncan here. This is our last unit explaining why Alabama has so many species. Here we're going to tie together the rich geologic and evolutionary history of the state with a specific explanation for why the state has so many species, particularly endemic species, and especially aquatic species, species that live in water environments. So let's get started. So remember, there's three reasons why Alabama has so many species in general. There's our warm, wet climate, which nurtures productive ecosystems. There's the geologic diversity of the state. So we've got lots of different types of rocks at the surface, lots of different types of topography or shapes to the landscape, and all of that yields different types of ecosystems. And then finally, we've got this very rich geologic and evolutionary history that are woven together to give us the evolution of many of the species that we've been learning about in class. So let's tie all this together and look specifically at aquatic species and how it all gets started here in Alabama. So endemism. Remember, endemism is a term that we use to explain a situation when a species is only found in a specific area. Usually we mean that on a very small scale. We might say a species is endemic to, say, Jefferson County or endemic to a particular state. But we could scale that up all the way to, say, endemic to an entire continent if we would. For example, kangaroos are endemic to Australia. Okay, so that's what endemism is. And as it turns out, Alabama has a really high degree of endemism. So you see down here, we have lots of state endemics and we have lots of near state endemics. In fact, we have a grand total of about 144. It's probably close to about 150, 160 now that we've discovered some more species. So roughly about 150 species in Alabama that are only found in Alabama. Can't find them in any other states. And we rank 7th in the US for total numbers of species that are endemic, species that are endemic. So I want to get a little more specific about the types of endemic species that exist. There's two. I want to start off with paleo-endemic species. So those are species that once had a very broad range, but then for perhaps environmental reasons or other reasons, it now has a very narrow range. So for example, we might have a species that has a very large range like this, maybe 1 million years ago, so 1 million years ago. And then because of, say, climate change and a change in the distribution of its habitats, it's now confined to just a smaller region of its former range that I'm trying to sort of circle in here with the red here. So maybe that is what we have now. Okay. And so this would be a species that once had a broader range and has now got a much more specific range, a much smaller range. And so we would say that the species is endemic to this new small area. We'd say it's a paleo-endemic because it's a species that's been around a long time. We've got lots of examples of species like that in the state, plant species and a few animal species as well. The other type of endemic that I want you to learn about are called neo-endemic species. These are species that are relatively new. They've evolved very recently, and so they have a very small range. So just to use the example I was using before, we might have a species that has a very small range, say if this is the state of Alabama of today, okay? It's got a very small range here, and maybe over time that range will expand to a much larger range. But for now, at least, it's only found in the area in which it evolved. And so we call that a neo-endemic. Neo, of course, meaning new. So it's newly evolved and hasn't had a chance to spread much. It may not spread much. We don't know. We can't see the future there. So next, I want to remind everybody about those two general steps that are involved in the process of a new species forming, because it's the formation of new species, which is why we've got all these endemic species in Alabama. And remember, that first step is called reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is when a formerly united population is then split into two or more separate populations, and they are no longer able to exchange genes through reproduction. So what's happening in one population over here stays in that population, and what happens genetically to another population that's farther away and separated stays to that population as well. And then, of course, the second step in the process of speciation is that you get genetic divergence. So those two or more populations that are now separated, they become genetically distinct over time as they either adapt to local conditions or other factors, maybe just because of sexual selection, one of the processes of microevolution that we learned about. Lots of different things can lead to it. Genetic drift can lead to it as well. Again, one of the processes of microevolution that lead to, over time, much larger changes in populations that can lead to new species. So these are the two steps I wanted to remind you of: reproductive isolation and then genetic divergence. And that's what leads to new species forming over time. Now, at the bottom here, you see allopatric speciation, our definition for allopatric speciation. Remember that that's the form of speciation that occurs when the two or more populations are separated by a geographic barrier. Maybe it's an ocean, maybe it's a river, or mountains, or a desert. Could be any of these things that prevent populations from contacting one another and exchanging genes. So now we're going to take a look at allopatric speciation in Alabama and how that has led to aquatic species, why we've got so many aquatic species. Remember, we've got more fishes and crayfish or crawfish, or whichever you prefer, freshwater mussels, freshwater snails, and other freshwater species. We have more of those than you find in any other state in the U.S. And in most places around the world. Now, to understand how these species have evolved, I want to focus just and specifically on species that we would call obligate freshwater species. Obligate freshwater species, which on your slides is going to be abbreviated as OFS because it's quite a lot to type out. These are species that are obligated, hence the term obligate. They're obligated to live in fresh water. That means they can't survive on land, so they're trapped in water. They can't hop out of the water and scoot across the land to a neighboring stream or lake or something like that. They are stuck in freshwater environments. So the second thing that I want to bring your attention to here is this map that's on the right, and this is a map of the state of Alabama, and superimposed on that in green and yellow is the shape of the Mobile River Basin. So this is a watershed, and all the waters that fall in the form of rain onto this landscape highlighted in green and yellow, they all drain down to the coast here, down at Mobile Bay. It looks like it doesn't reach the coast here where the laser pointer is, but actually that's the top of Mobile Bay. It's just the map doesn't show the bay. So again, this is the watershed for the Mobile River Basin, and all of the rivers and streams that are connected in that landscape flow down ultimately to the Mobile Bay. Okay, so obligate freshwater species that are in the Mobile River Basin are stuck in this basin, and they don't have contact. There's no way for them to have a contact with or escape into the adjacent watersheds. Now, there's a couple of reasons why species that are found in this Mobile River Basin are unable to slip over into adjacent watersheds. The first off, of course, is that there's a land barrier. So around the margins of the watershed, you're surrounded by hills and mountains and lands that these species can't cross. But the other is down at the coast. For species, for example, to slip from the Mobile River Basin into, say, the Mississippi River Basin, those freshwater species would have to swim out into the Mobile Bay habitats and then out into the Gulf of Mexico and over to the mouth of the Mississippi River and then swim up into the Mississippi River. The problem with that is that most freshwater species cannot handle salt water. And so in the process of trying to do that, and they wouldn't even try in most cases, but should they try to do that, they would actually die in most cases. There's a few notable exceptions, but most would die. So all that to say that the Mobile River Basin is kind of like an island. There's no way for freshwater species to escape into the surrounding lands or oceans around it. So when I start talking about islands and evolution, you should be thinking about, those are the kinds of situations that lead to the evolution of new species. And in fact, that's true, and it's even more complex than that in Alabama. So let's look at this next map. This is a map of the Mobile River Basin, but it's now subdivided into the 7 distinct watersheds that form the basin. For example, you see highlighted here in yellow is the Black Warrior River Basin. It's the one that's shaped like a bare footprint, like a left foot of a footprint of a left foot without a shoe on. And you also see the other river basins here in sort of paler colors. Everything from the Cahaba to the Coosa, Tallapoosa, the Alabama River Basin, the Tombigbee, etc., and the Mobile Basin down at the very bottom. Okay. Now, the point that I want to make is that in each of these sub-basins or sub-watersheds, again, the species are confined to those watersheds except for the place at the bottom of the watershed where the main river connects to another main river. Let me try to illustrate that here with a highlighter. So here's the Black Warrior Basin, okay? I didn't circle that perfectly here, but if a species were to try to get into an adjacent watershed, it would have to come all the way down here to where the Black Warrior Basin joins, in this case, the Cahaba Basin, which is right next door. Otherwise, all these lands that are highlighted in yellow, there's no other way for freshwater species to escape from their freshwater environments into adjacent portions of the Mobile River Basin. Okay, so we're going to even dive just a little bit deeper here and looking at the things that cause differences across the landscape within the Mobile River Basin. So the map that you see is the same map as before, but this time we've superimposed the 5 major geologic regions of the state that intersect with the river basins. And what I want you to understand is that in each of those different zones, the different color zones that you see there, the conditions are different in the rivers for a variety of reasons. In some cases, it has to do with water chemistry. It might be more acidic or it might be more basic. In some cases, it has to do with the shape of the rivers. Some rivers are more sinuous and they're curving all around the place, and others are more linear. There's lots of different ways that streams can vary from one to the next, and that winds up shaping the conditions that affect the evolution of the species within those areas. So all of this to say that within the Mobile River Basin, you've got a tremendous variety of different types of rivers and streams that have different environments in which species are going to adapt to those specific conditions in those areas. And of course, this leads, you can see where this is going. This is leading up to why Alabama has so many aquatic species that are distinct. Now you might be thinking, gosh, how hard is it for a fish or a crawfish or a snail or a mussel to travel through our streams and rivers downstream and into an adjacent watershed? I mean, as you saw in the last slide, the Coosa watershed and the Tallapoosa and the Cahaba watershed are sort of nested side by side. Why can't they just swim downstream? Well, that's what this slide's about. What you see in the top picture is an image of the typical headwaters that you find at the top of the watershed, where the streams are up in the mountains and the hills. They're very rocky and shallow. Very, very different environments than what you see in the bottom picture. This is representing where the rivers have grown really large. They're on the coastal plain. They're deep. They're dark. The water tends to be more muddy, and the water doesn't have the same conditions that can support the species that are living in the upper watersheds, the small streams that you find up in the hills and the mountains. So all of this to illustrate that even within a river, there are conditions in the river that trap species in portions of that watershed, that river's watershed, so that they can't easily move even within the watershed. So they wind up being trapped in those local areas, and then that gives them an opportunity to become new species. To illustrate that a little bit further here, I've taken our map of the sub-basins of the Mobile River Basin and drawn two fish that are one in the Black Warrior Basin, the yellow basin that you see here, and then one in the upper portions of the Coosa River Basin. And you see that a red line that's there dividing them, that of course is a line of hills that separate the two watersheds. And keep in mind here, I'm using the term watershed and basin kind of interchangeably. River scientists do that all the time, and so I've kind of developed the habit of doing that as well. Now, one of the things I want to point out, and let me pause here while I get my laser pointer going here. Okay, one of the things that I want to point out is that these two fish that you have up here, even though they are living in streams that are just a couple miles apart, would just take you a few minutes to walk from one to the next. If this fish on the right wanted to travel all the way down, all the way over and visit and perhaps mate with the fish that's on the other side, it would have to travel from the headwaters up here all the way down through the main stem of the Coosa. And mind you, already it's in habitats that it can't really survive very well in because it's a small headwater stream fish that hangs out in shallow rocky waters. It would have to travel all the way down here past Montgomery, and it's now in the Alabama River Basin, all the way down here, and further down. I'll speed up because this is probably boring for you, and then all the way up the Tombigbee River. Okay, you see it's making its path up here all the way up. Let's see, we need to go up I think the Mulberry Fork, which goes up like this, all the way up there. Okay, that would be a journey of several hundred miles through all sorts of conditions that are not optimal for small fishes and crayfishes and snails and mussels that live in those headwater zones. So basically, that's not going to happen. And all that to illustrate, again, that point that there are many ways that freshwater species get isolated when you superimpose watersheds on top of a mountainous, hilly landscape. And that leads to aquatic species evolution. So it's processes like that that lead to the evolution of beautiful creatures like this one depicted here. This is the vermilion darter. It's a small fish that's about as big as my finger. Here we go. About as big as my finger, okay, at max, and at its maximum size. And it's found in just one watershed called Turkey Creek, which is found in the northern part of Jefferson County. And this is the watershed where we try to take students during our lab to show them the fishes, and many times they get to see this beautiful fish, the vermilion darter. But this fish is only found in 14 miles of one stream. So that's what we would say is a very highly endemic species. It is definitely a state endemic, but it is, and even amongst the state endemics, it's one of those that has one of the most narrow ranges of them all. Okay, so to begin to wrap things up here, again, let's review the reasons why Alabama has so many species. It has to do with the warm, wet climate, which winds up sustaining very productive ecosystems, long growing seasons, lots of water, lots of heat, lots of sunlight. So our ecosystems are very productive. That supports a lot of animal life. Point number two is that we've got this diverse geology, right? Thanks to the Appalachian Mountains and all those rock layers that would ordinarily have been buried deep below the surface or have been thrust up to the surface, and different rock types erode into different types of soils. Different soils support different plants support different animals. Also, that diverse geology separates the watersheds into these large, distinct watersheds that allow aquatic species to adapt to local conditions and become unique from their ancestral populations. And so we see a lot of evidence of allopatric speciation in Alabama when it comes to our aquatic species. And of course, that third point down here is that it's this rich evolutionary history which is tied to our deep time, our geologic history, that is why that has produced so many species in the state. Okay, so that's a wrap. Be sure to reach out to me if any of these concepts you'd like to hear more explanation for them, or more examples, or more information about them. See you soon.